Hello there, David Bradley, aka Schizophreniforms, and this is a video, more or less, that I don't think will ever see the light of day, and I'm not going to be too specific in it about anything in particular, or anyone in particular, or any particular aspect of my own experience. I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable making it, and I'll probably edit out most of it, if not use it at all. We'll see how it goes, actually. So the topic of the video is violence in general, as a broad kind of overview. But, where to begin? Violence is a systemic chained event, in my opinion. There's never an isolated incident without cause when it comes to violence. It may have to be tracked back a few years, but there's always a absolute categorical reason someone resorts to violence. That could be pathology, that could be trauma, that could be that they're a dangerous person, but even with that, like, we'll start at the top with the worst example. Someone who's a murderer or a serial killer or something, or, like, to take an even more extreme example, someone who commits genocide, like, say, Hitler or something. The kind of psychology that has to develop within an individual to be able to commit those acts, especially when you look at things like free will, self-determinism, but also in a less philosophical standpoint, the kind of damage you would have to have had done to you to be able to do something like that and live with it is unfathomable. Like, so there's an extreme example. So we might take someone like a serial killer. They're locked up in, like, death row in America or something, sentenced to death for doing some unnamed chain of horrific things. I've heard some very compelling arguments that someone like that, I don't know how to put it, it's not like they're not to blame for their actions. Everyone's responsible for what they've done, but there's this sense of, like, they must be really messed up to be in that circumstance. It must have required a particular avenue of existence for them that must have just been so horrific. There may be genetic precursors, predispositions, sociopathic tendencies, a kind of genetic factor, but then to actually have those things flourish into the actual acts that take place is, well, it's just inconceivable. What like, even in a more formalized scenario where murder takes place, like in a war zone, the training, conditioning it takes for a soldier to go into a position where they're willing to kill someone is profound. And I'm not comparing soldiers to serial killers. They're obviously different type of people, and everyone will have their own opinion about that. But what I'm saying is the conditioning and the circumstances and environmental factors required to lead to heinous acts are more or less, the odds have to be stacked in favour of that being a potential outcome, let's say. So that's the little preface to the video. I'm going to have a little breather because this is an entirely uncomfortable topic for me. So yeah, I'll be back in a sec. So the next topic, well, the next related thing to what I want to talk about, which correlates almost a bit to the first part, was that there is no such thing as isolated violence. And I kind of touched on that at the start. There's no such thing as some finite endpoint where someone wasn't predisposed to the act that took place. Now, like I mentioned before, it could be through pathology, it could be through their own torment or torture or abuse. Could be a psychological dysfunction, it could be a genetic dysfunction, it could be a head injury, it could be something as simple as the fact of, well, I say simple, but it's incredibly complex, but not as having a supportive environment when growing up. And the stimuli, the triggers of life, all of it, like you can trace it back generation after generation after generation. I saw a good meme about this recently. It was sort of like not addressing the hurt you feel, not facing, I'm paraphrasing massively, but not enduring the pain you feel for the transgressions that have taken place against you in your life, however great or small, ultimately leads to the continuation of that same process in whether it be friends or offspring or family or just co-workers or the society at large. Like, there has to be a certain point where you break the chain of whether it be violence, emotional abuse, any other form of abuse. There has to be a point when you break that chain and let it crush you for a bit, go through the grief, and then come out of it with a perspective of, at least I've dealt with this, and now I'm not spreading this horrible disease of violence and abuse and sickness into the rest of society and the world around you. The onus of responsibility is on the individual, and that's not a small task. That's not like a small thing to take. That's not a small statement. It's huge, but the implications of it are that dealing with your own problems, dealing with your own traumas. This is all prompted by the 1 year reflection, because, as I stated in that video, I kind of went through a process of reacquisition of memories, let's say, and trauma in life. And it could be something small, it could be something where no one actually did anything wrong and I found it traumatic because of the conditions of my mind, my schizophrenia, my psychosis, all the kind of bizarre experiences I had, even just being in an extreme state through fear or agitation or other circumstances that can create that kind of profound state of tension. And what I've realised is quite well summed up by that meme, which is that I was just referencing. The book has to stop with you. Like, at the end of the day, no one is responsible for what happened to them, but they are able, given the right circumstances, to stop doing that to other people. It's hard to describe. It's hard to describe what I'm trying to say, because it's a tender subject for me alone, let alone trying to present this to other people in a public forum. Like, it's almost terrifying. But trauma in general, through abuse or violence, or even something such as, in my case, like, the worst thing that could have happened to me when I was psychotic was to be put in effectively equivalent to a cell, which was surrounded by people who were harmful and dangerous, and all had their own problems that led to them being that way. And I won't tell you where I was or the connotations of that, but when I sectioned myself out of concern for my sanity, yeah, that was just such a bad move in a weird way. But it did scare the shit out of me, so I didn't go back. But what it also taught me was that these are chains of events. Like, we look at the prison system, look at mental health institutions in general. These people are so badly damaged, so criminalised, so abused, so subject to their experience that they cannot escape it and thus enact it. That's kind of the crux of this video. And you can taper it down to the smallest thing, like, take it down. So we started with the serial killer example, the genocide example, very grandiose and extreme, and quite a shocking intro, which is deliberate to a certain extent. Then we're going to taper it down to the smallest thing, like, say you get on a bus and you pay the driver and you're in a bad mood. The driver might be sat there perfectly chilled, or vice versa, the driver's in a bad mood and you're there sunny and smiling and beaming at him. And either way round it works, if that person gives you even the smallest inflection of a negative look that you pick up on consciously, that might completely derail yours or theirs frame of mind. Like, and it might only be a gradual process, but there's this kind of erosion over time. There's this sense that it's almost like an equilibrium, like, which is always in debt. There's always a debt of aggression and violence and misery. There's parts of life that there's always in credit. There's always in a position of not having grounding in the exaltation of their own existence, things like that. So this section, what I'm essentially saying is, as I titled it, there's no such thing as isolated violence. There is no genesis to original violence. And I use that word kind of deliberately, as in like the dawn of man. Like, violence begets violence, begets violence, begets violence, begets violence. It continues until the person subject to it finds a healthy and responsible and genuinely relieving way to dissipate that aggression within themselves. And that's it for that section. I shall return. So the next sort of related topic on this video in regards to violence, obviously I've stated that there's no such thing as isolated violence. I've been very forgiving so far of people who commit sometimes minor things, sometimes major things, but I've been trying to err on the side of logic and compassion towards understanding that there's no such thing as an isolated event. Like the previous section said, there's no such thing as isolated violence. Compassion is a big part of it. Forgiveness is a huge part of it. Because if I carry with, like, say someone beat you up in school over your sweets, that's a harrowing experience, especially for a child. So you're being deprived of something you love, you're being violently assaulted, you're being humiliated, you're in the position of walking away from it physically damaged and emotionally scarred. And if you don't find this, for a lot of people, it takes years and years of real work to get to the point where they can forgive even that. To get to the point where you've accepted, and it's so often I've said this to people who get bullied or abused, or like people who suffered severe violence, or people who suffered. It's just come up so many times when I'm talking to people in general in life. Is like, you don't know the circumstances that person's in, and if you envision them for even one, if you can allow yourself to envision the circumstances that led your bully, your abuser, to be your bully and your abuser, compassion floods in. Simple as that. Even if it's just for a second, it's not comfortable. Like I've again, like I said at the start of this very first part of the video, like I'm not here to point out who did what and where and when and why. What I'm talking about is how to deal with it. What the consequences of not processing it and taking responsibility for your own life can be. Because I don't know. People who refuse, I can't explain it. There's this thing that vexes me, like it always has for a very long time, is this such a thing as an unforgivable act. And our whole society is dictated around that, our whole law system is dictated around that. And there's acts that the consequences of which will never be forgotten. There's acts which are intolerable to society and with which I agree people need to be removed, such as in prison systems or in environments where people have done something so bad and the damage to them and the damage they did is so severe that they can't effectively be rehabilitated within the current systems at the very least. And the key factor for not becoming an abuser is forgiveness. If you're harbouring with you, if you're carrying with you this horrible burden of the thing that happened to you with no comprehension, no willingness to comprehend the state of the person who did it, you will see them as evil, for starters, and there will be no grey area. And every other area of your life, you might be a gradated, rational, calm, observing person. But to think, what I'm trying to say is, the point isn't to think about like, oh, I forgive the person who did this unequivocally because, and it makes everything they did acceptable. No, that is not the case. Like, there are acts that are unacceptable and can't be taken back and need to be either punished or taken out of society for a very specific point, that once a boundary has been crossed, there needs to be consequences. That's fine. I'm with that. But for the person who's been abused, now it seems the way I'm arguing in this video implies that I'm siding with the abusers. What I'm actually doing is talking about, I'm reluctant to say anything too in depth, but the abuse that I've suffered in my own life, real severe violence, being choked and smashed into a concrete floor, or things like that. But I'm not going to go any more detail in, but the whole point about this is that how do I deal with what, when dwelled upon, can create insurmountable anger and resentment and hatred that poisons my well. It makes me bitter, it makes me aggressive, it makes me, what's the word? Hypersensitive to acts of aggression, microaggressions. And in my case, that's abject fear is my response, like oversensitivity in the adverse. So I'm so afraid of violence. Like I got beaten up recently in the pavilion. So someone asked me for a cigarette paper, because it was in the bottom of my pocket. I stood up to offer, this kind of partly why this is on my mind so much, as well as memories and things. But I stood up to give them a Rizla, and that was taken as an act of aggression, and I was terrified. They knew it. I tried to be calm and strong, but I'm even shaking thinking about it now. But as soon as I'd showed a weakness and vulnerability and given them an excuse to be violent, so I got punched around 10 times, 10 times, 4 or 5, I don't know. They swung at me a lot, I didn't go down, and then they legged it. But the point is, I was violently assaulted. I'm using it as an example. I was violently assaulted for giving someone something in a polite fashion, and they clearly were out to commit an act of violence, or at least saw the opportunity to, and had no qualms about it. I bust my lip open. I've still got aching in my jaw. This was a few weeks, nearly a month ago, I think. And if I just, and I've dealt with it fine. Like the first 2 days, I was consumed with frustration and humiliation and anger, and wishing that I hadn't been stopped from chasing them so I could violently assault them myself in retaliation. But I'm glad that I did restrain myself and did have the support of friends to say you don't need to do that. Like, and the whole point of that is that, of me mentioning this, is that I got over the frustration of something that as a younger man would have stayed with me for years. It would have plagued me. It would have driven me to absolute insanity with frustration and anger and humiliation, and I would have turned it in on myself. Like, part of the reason, or part of the content in my voice hearing and is persecutors, people that have abused me in the past. It's reoccurringly having dreams, nightmares, visions, auditory and visual hallucinations of these people repeating the abuse. Like, that's not uncommon in schizophrenia. But I got over it. But I'm literally, it only popped into my head now as a kind of relevant example of how thinking that, like the bully in school, like if those guys were out in a situation where they were so easily agitated, so terrified, so prone to aggression, they must have had some pretty contentious environmental factors to lead them to be willing to be so aggressive and so scared when I didn't get knocked out by the several punches. Because they, yeah, it's just mad. Like, there's no way of validating it as an acceptable behaviour, and I don't intend to. But the point is that I don't see, like as I stated in the earlier section of the video, there is no isolated violence. There is no way I can look at that person now. Now I've had time to contemplate it in past experiences of violence, and think, yeah, they're just a bad person. They're just evil. They're just malevolent. Because I don't. Well, I believe in malevolence and benevolence, but the whole context that those things are sporadic or innate or unchangeable or entirely at the discretion of the person being that way. Like try and just feel happy now. Obviously, with the context of this video, it's difficult, but try and just manually switch on. I'm fine. Everything's okay. This isn't a harrowing subject. Even if you can do it, there's a resistance to change. There's an inability to choose what emotions you have any more than you can choose what thoughts you have, any more than you can choose what experiences you have, what perceptions you have. The only thing you can really train and take control of, and even that's debatable, is your reactions to things. What you do when you've had time to think about it and you've calmed down from the situation. And yeah, it's just an interesting thing. It's a really interesting thing to actually navigate, because the more you are able to take a step back and go, yeah, I feel anger. It's right to feel anger. I'm okay with being angry. I might even have a big rant or go for a stompy walk, or maybe even punch a cushion if it's really unbearable. But the point is that your reaction to the situation can be trained out. You can't choose, like for me, like I can't choose when a voice comes. It might come now while I'm talking. Now I've said it, it's probably more likely to. Like it might be a persecutory voice, it might be a violent voice. In fact, it is coming now I've said it, and it's highly disturbing. The point is that my reaction to that abuse can either diffuse it, proliferate it, or internalize it. So you can be unmovable and just completely unaffected by it, consciously completely unaffected by it, even though you experience agitation physically, and you can't necessarily control your physical symptoms, you can't control your emotions. What you can control is what you do in reaction to the sensations that arise in your mind. That's, to me, is the only thing you can control in life. So you can diffuse it, you can continue it, whether that be fighting back, or continuing, like we've been talking about earlier in the video, by then entrenching that into someone else's life and spreading the virus, or you can just let it flow over you, let it flow past, let it cease to be relevant. There's so many ways of dealing with it. This is why meditation is a very effective thing, because it gives you a sense of, for lack of a better way of putting it, a sense of dissociation. Meditation isn't a cure for everything. Meditation can cause problems, but in general, one of the good things that I have developed from meditation is this conscious, what they call it, the metta bhavana meditation, the loving kindness meditation, where you consciously expand the sphere of what you allow yourself to feel compassion for, who you allow yourself to feel compassion for, who you consider on a daily basis. And maybe I'll add in at some point like what the metta bhavana meditation, the actual ins and outs of it, but it's a meditation on loving kindness. And what I learned from those kind of techniques is the ability to put myself aside for a second, which is incredibly useful. It's almost like conscious dissociation in a weird way, but in a controlled and healthy format, in a safe place, in a closed environment, when you revisit these things, when you look at them, when you analyse them. And there's things people have done to me which, in retrospect, were the unforgivable acts of sociopaths, as far as I can tell. And that obviously contradicts everything I just said, to a certain extent. But like even if like sociopathy, I don't know enough about it to make a judgment. But to lack empathy is either an adaptation skill in my mind, or a trauma-related incident, or a neurological disorder. I don't know any more about it than that. But that's either way. They're in a situation. A true sociopath would be in a situation where that they feel no empathy. They can't make themselves feel empathy. If they lack empathy, they lack empathy. If they're incapable of being empathic, what I'm talking about is trying to incite the exact opposite response. Love thy neighbour, love thy persecutor, because it's the only way it's going to stop. Compassion and consideration, and not allowing yourself to proliferate their violence. I think that'll do for now, but I'll summarise by saying that forgiveness isn't some fluffy, light spiritual principle. Forgiveness is a commitment in your own life to end violence, more or less. It's the commitment to so I cut off at the end there because my camera turned off. But yeah, I was trying to say that forgiveness is a commitment to non-proliferation of violence, non-continuation, non-spreading of the illness or disease or malevolence of society that has preceded you, and kind of diffuse it, and own it, take responsibility for your own actions rather than continuing on a cycle of violence. So this next section, I've got a few choices of what I wanted to say. Towards the end of the last section, I briefly touched, I think it was in just one phrase, but on the internalization of violence. And that is a big thing for me that I think is really important, because I've had the kind of life and a plethora of experiences and a few particularly acute cases of people conditioning and programming certain ways of thinking about myself into me, seeing vulnerability, exploiting it through their own trauma, drama, life they've had. And I'm not here to complain about my life, but I do need to use it as an example because it's my only source of information. It's the whole reason I'm making this, because the experiences of my life. And I think it's important to think about how you talk to yourself internally. That's the thing I really learned. I learned this quite a bit from NLP, kind of therapy that I had as a teenager. I learned it further in CBT. I learned it in a variety of different things. And the self-talk, the chatter that you have in your mind, like some of the ways that people, if you actually get them to open up about it or analyse it or even just think about it in your own self, like the kind of brutal things you'll say to yourself, like you put on a bit of weight or something, you're like, oh, you fat fuck, that's disgusting. Like the narrative that goes through your head, you might not even consciously be doing it, but when you take a step back and analyse it, it could be the slightest thing. It could be conditioned through societal values. It could be not through trauma whatsoever, but the kind of self-talk and the abuse that you give yourself is, if you saw someone doing that to someone else, you would intervene, if not like be incredibly harsh about it. Do you know what I mean? On behalf of the person suffering it. There's no greater obscenity that is caused by violence and abuse than the kind of internalization of that violence and abuse into the abused. And in my case, it manifests as voices and physical sensations of burning, of scraping, being stabbed, scratched, etc., etc., etc. But the thing that I've most had to reprogram to come out of the kind of cycle of my own negative self-talk and my own, like, to recover from a lot of the peripheral sides of what may have incited my schizophrenia, was to learn to navigate my self-talk and manage it and mediate it and have a kind of, as bizarre as it might sound, an additional self-motivated voice that challenges the suppositions of my internal narrative about myself. I'm just as prone to mania as I am depression. I'm just as prone to hatred as I am love. I'm just as prone to any, do you know what I mean? Like, but I suffered from clinical depression for a very, very long time, like severe clinical depression, just endless self-harm, so many suicide attempts that I staved off for 5 years and then was provoked. I directly told to kill myself, and then when it didn't work, I was told, try harder next time. So I'm not I'm trying to stay calm about this, because this is what sort of why I didn't want to do this video, because it brings into mind the kind of abuse and the kind of programming conditioning that took place throughout various stages of my life, and the way I've managed to mediate and mitigate those abusive conditionings is to start to take a meditative or reflective step back from continuing that abuse to myself. And there's loads of things you can do in cognitive behavioural therapy. NLP as a therapeutic approach is really useful as well. Realising that it's a big part of how we learn, like in cognitive science. You make maps of how people learn. So say you have a tutor at school who really inspires you, and say it's music. Like for me, that's a personal subject. Like my music tutors have, for the most part, been profoundly inspiring people. And what happens from a very, very young age is you start to repeat the things that are said to you. Sometimes externally, like I see in my son. Like if I'm even the slightest bit cruel or kind to my son, he will repeat that behaviour and reflect it back to me. And then over time, things like that become internalised. So you take more or less what they call in cognitive science a model. You make an internal model of that person, so that you no longer need them to be there, to the point where, for example, in the case of voice hearing, you can have an external, like how many times in your life have you had a dialogue, especially someone you're upset with, an ongoing dialogue in your life with that person when they're not present, like an argument or an ongoing battle for supremacy in your own mind. It's because of internalization. It happens the other way around in really nice scenarios as well. You get couples that can communicate almost telepathically, seemingly so, after being together for 50 years, because they've got such an acute sense of how the other one works, and it's so accurate that it only takes a very small amount of correction, a very small amount of code input for them to have a quite thoroughly accurate perspective of the partner's intent, desire, will, thoughts even, and down to what they're going to say next. You see it in, there's loads of pleasant examples of it, but getting in the way of how you talk to yourself, because even if it's a good thing, you need to be conscious of the narrative you're telling yourself. You need to be conscious of the way you talk to yourself, the way you, what you permit and what you don't. And it may be a case of just starting off with that's not accurate. It may be a case of starting with, I disagree. And then slowly, you catch yourself more and more, and you add in more and more of these little disagreements until the abuser that's had the full voice, because the thing is with negative emotions and negative self-feedback, like that captures your attention very profoundly, whereas the positive stuff, especially if you suffer from depression or you've been suffered violence or abuse or systemic abuse even, you're more, and it's just part of the way we work as human beings, like we're more prone to memorize and internalize the processes of abuse so that we can avoid them, so we can navigate them. Like fear and harmful situations, you need to be acutely sensitive to when you're in danger, and obviously that can mistrigger various things and create like obsessive or intrusive or various kinds of thoughts. I'm not sort of discussing that at the moment, but yeah, that's just one thing I wanted to cover, is internalization of violence, because I was reviewing the previous footage and it comes up a lot for me. Like you don't realise until you start to monitor this how much you've, even because I was saying earlier about how you might act out in your life, and it quite often happens subconsciously, like you won't even know you're thinking about a violent event when you're being violent, but it's there, and you can see what I mean, I'm sure. Yeah, and you relive these scenarios, and then the worst and the most easiest, actually the worst effect is internally on yourself, because you tolerate stuff from yourself that you wouldn't from anyone else. And it's models of these abusers, and that initially is really difficult to navigate, because then you're like, okay, this is I've got them in me, that's horrible. But as soon as you do that, sooner you can start to almost, for lack of a better word, exorcise them from you, exorcise them from you. You can, once you realise they're in there, you can start to challenge their behaviour directly and take a more dominant role until eventually they either cease to exist or become a healthy part of the sort of prefrontal cortex, which is the self-critical analysis, which can be over-exaggerated in people that have suffered abuse. So that's that section of just something I wanted to prop up the last part of the video with, and I shall be back post haste. So continuing on from that is the next sort of section of it, which is very prevalent for me. I touched on it a little bit before, which was about dissociation. And there's healthy dissociation, and there's more commonly unhealthy dissociation. And to use a crude metaphor, it's like going to a happy place when a traumatic thing happens. And obviously these things can become profoundly difficult when they're left unchecked. And one of the problems that I've faced with this prior violence or abuse or the aforementioned sociopathic stuff is that there's a kind of switch off mode that you can be put into that's really harmful, and let's come away from that for a second. Like, I find social situations enormously stressful, and like, when I go out and about, that's when it's most acute. So like, I'm more prone to hearing voices, I'm more prone to perceiving these abusers, I'm more prone to these various hallucinations and all this kind of stuff when I'm in public. And there's a sense of dissociation from that. There's also, it's really difficult for me to talk about, so I'm trying to hold a thread. When someone just goes on and on and on and on and on aggressively about something, you stop and work you into a state of violence, or sorry, not violence, anxiety through violence or aggression. There's this kind of dissociation that takes place where you stop being able to follow the narrative. It just becomes a glaring, aggressive hum firing at you, and you're no longer perceiving it, but your subconscious and the background of your mind and the part of you that it steps in to dissociate the core part of your mind from trauma is still taking in that information. And this is where a lot of conditioning takes place in abusers, and that can be a really hard thing. I'm relating this back to the prior section of the way you talk to yourself and the internalization, but there's also a kind of level of subconscious programming that needs to be really gone through carefully with counsellors and therapists and support, and just delicately, carefully analysed, because it can be enormously difficult to navigate, because you may only realise these things are acting out through you at the point at which they've already happened. And this is why I call violence like a virus, or the virus of violence, the kind of the perpetuation of violence through not addressing it directly. And this is a broad subject I'm trying to be vague about, but the rough gist is that you get dissociation through repeated trauma. You get the point where you get things like dissociative identity disorder, which there's some debate over the legitimacy of, but I've certainly experienced elements of dissociation and fractured psyche. Like I used to call myself Bradley and then Brad, and then I had this whole explanation of the development of my ego, and when I say ego, I mean the aware ego, the conscious part of me that is in control of my body. I've had to have reintegration therapy to kind of deal with the fractured nature of how I've managed to survive reality without killing myself, basically. And the thing that, what am I trying to draw from this? That's the thing, it's really hard to approach, but when you've experienced violence and trauma as a regular thing, and it's not just one traumatic event, it's an ongoing abuse, I would strongly advise getting some support when facing that. And this is like the prior video I made talking about my year of abstinence and the kind of reasons I turned to substances or alcohol or avoidance in general, over-medicated state from whether that be recreational substances or what I was prescribed. Like, I'm on a lot less medication now than I have been. I'm still on the full, anyway, that's not anyone's business, but like, I've been able to reduce my pharmaceutical dependence as well as my recreational dependence because I'm starting to face and accept the things that have happened to me and learn to navigate them. And yeah, I would just say, don't expect, like, if you think you can cope, that's fine, but there's parts of the programming and conditioning process that can be unpicked, they can be undone. You can, and my essential point is that it's okay to seek outside help with these things. They're incredibly complex issues, and it can be like mentioned earlier, this is, you know, one, this is hard for me to talk about, and two, there's a conditioning process that goes down through generation to generation to generation, or out into society, or one traumatic event in society leads to dozens of traumatic events. Yeah, and so we've covered sort of dissociation, a bit of trauma, and I'm not going to suggest particular therapies, but cognitive behavioural therapy is always a good start for everyone because it gives you that space from yourself. Mindfulness-based cognitive behavioural therapy is really good as well because it gives you the ability to almost mentally step back from yourself whilst doing the CBT and go into a place of deep serenity and then carry that out through the rest of your life. But in general, this basic section was just to talk about a little bit of my own trauma experience because I haven't really covered that, and like from watching back the video earlier, I feel like it sounds like I'm going, you should just forgive them, let them get on with it, they've had loads of problems and it's not their fault, and nothing could be further from my internal natural response to those kind of situations and those people that have done these things throughout all of society and the plethora of variations how it happens. I was trying to get to the point of the only way you can move on and not perpetuate that process through your own frustrations and damage from them is to go through a process of reflection, to go through a process of healing, to go through a process of grieving and accepting what's happened to you, because it's the only way you're going to really truly move forward. And that can be done in your own way. Like I've written a note here, the photograph approach. I've referenced this in conversation with people who have particular trouble with violent or upsetting or otherwise recurrent processes that they're unable to manage. It's about disarming memories. I was given some good advice about this by someone close to me a number of years ago, and it's been really useful for me in recent times, the past year or two, of processing these recurring and returning memories, which is you kind of, say you've got a photograph, I think I mentioned this in other videos before, but say you've got a photograph of like your birthday when you were 6, and you haven't seen that, say you're like 30 years old, like I'm 31, so that's a good example. Say you had a photograph of a party when you were like 6, and it was like, you look at it and you're like, oh, I remember it, oh, that was so crazy, oh wow, that was such a long time ago, I can't believe I remember that. I remember just that exact moment. It's really beautiful, really powerful. But then if you leave that on the mantelpiece and you look at it every day, slowly it just becomes like a part of the background. It slowly, you don't even really notice it's there anymore. There's a certain acclimatization to your environment, which the whole of the topic could go into. But it's sort of like why once you've got a car, you start wanting a better car, and it's what consumerism plays on in general. It's this acclimatization, but that's a separate subject. What you need, well, not what you need to do personally, but what I've found is really useful for approaching the memories and associations and learning to navigate what's happened to me, is just to slowly go, oh, okay, and each time the reaction's less extreme because you've seen it, until you can just have it there and you just like, just a photograph, man. It's not happening now. I'm so acclimatized to it, it's almost boring. And for me, that process that I'm describing is giving me an enormous amount of relief. Yeah, so that's just a few things I wanted to touch on, and I'm pretty much going to go to a conclusion now of like a summary of what I've been trying to say, but I need some time to think about it, so I'm going to end the video of this section of the video just there. I shall be back. So, to sort of begin to conclude what has been actually for me quite a harrowing video to make, but it's something I really wanted to do. I'll start with that. It's something I really wanted to do because one of the big parts of anyone who has suffered, and this is what I want to make a clear distinction of at the end of the video, so this is left at the last point before I go into like a full conclusion, and there'll be some links and things like that at the end that might be useful if you're experiencing kind of violence and trauma. But the point I want to get to is this kind of the idea of Stockholm syndrome, the idea that you become attached to the person abusing you, and it's an interesting tenet of psychology. Like eventually, so for me, one of the people that caused me the most harm, this is really difficult to talk about. It took me years to get them out of my life, to the point where I had to engineer a scenario whereby the situation was untenable for us to continue contact. And yeah, it's crazy what you go through, because even until relatively recent times, this person, talking like 6-7 years, but the continuation on in my psyche, the attempts at contact that I found myself making and things like this, I don't know. You get this kind of, it's really upsetting to talk about. No, fuck it. So the point I'm trying to get to is that you get some sort of misplaced attachment to people that abuse you, and I'm trying to distinguish this from what I was saying earlier of like having compassion for someone and accepting their behaviour and not trying to modify it or escape them are two entirely different things. And sometimes the natural inclination is to not escape them out of some, like you often see it where there's children involved, or where a couple's been together for like 10 years or so, or something like that. And it can be enormously difficult to escape someone because it means that your entire life has to change. It can be enormously difficult to let go of someone that gives you definition to your character, because they've conditioned you for so long that you lose your sense of identity without that process continuing. Yeah, and that's really hard for me to talk about. That's all I'm going to say in regard to that. So I guess the emphasis of this last section is I'm going to add some links either along here or possibly down in the description. There's women's centres. There's the Samaritans. There are, if there's children involved, there's lines for like child protection. There's numbers that the children can call. There's male specific domestic violence and violence related clinics and chat lines and things like that. I will add a few more. It's just, this is unbearably difficult for me to talk about. But the point is that there is a way out. Like, and no matter how hard it seems at the time, that you don't have to continue being identified by your abuser. You don't have to continue identifying with them. You don't have to continue allowing it to take place. And it can take an enormous sense of courage, and you can be taking real, genuine risks. Like, if this person's extremely violent, they could potentially harm you, and you need. If this is something that affects you, I think a discreet acquisition of support and like acting sooner rather than later is really important. Yeah, because people that abuse have very systematic ways of justifying what they've done. People that are abused have very systematic ways of justifying what the person's done to them. And it's only once both people exit the scenario that either of them can start to get any kind of real perspective on either, in the case of the abuser, what they did to the other person and how to navigate that and how to prevent it from ever happening. In the case of the abused, how to integrate and live with and move on from what was done, which is basically the primary focus of this video. And it is quite hard that I have to feel like a sense of obligation to make this, but there's been so much stuff in the media lately. It's mainly like there's a lot of stuff in regards to sexual abuse, but it's violent abuse that this is the primary focus of. But abuse in general, just like taking advantage of people's vulnerabilities and things like that, I feel like I have a moral obligation to speak out a little bit, even if it doesn't reach anyone, just because there's some sense of like acknowledgement that this is more commonplace than people give it credit for. And this is, I think, with in pertaining to sexual abuse, that's been very much present in the media, because and people, it's coming out of the woodwork, left, right and centre, how much abuse has taken place in what are some, I can't go too much into it. The point I'm trying to make anyway is that it's not too late until it's too late, so act sooner rather than later. And you know, no one would say to you you've done something wrong by escaping someone you perceive as an abuser. And if you're watching this thinking about yourself, it's not too late to change your behaviour and get help if you've suffered abuse and find that you can't know. Because I struggle with frustration and anxiety. It's primarily manifest as fear and anxiety, but the agony of schizophrenia is that, especially with the dissociative tendencies I have, is just constantly reliving hyper vivid versions of past scenarios and never being able to escape them. And it's learning to get through that and escaping the abuser, that goes hand in hand. Those are the two things that really need to be focused on for getting some sense of integration and holism and the development and release in your life. And I may not even publish this video, but yeah, it's a subject that I'm got heart palpitations just talking about it. And it takes tremendous, incredible courage to do it, but also it just takes one phone call to the police and straight up own up, but it's like, just tell them what's been happening to you. And it doesn't even have to be the police. There's people that work specifically in like clinics. I'll put some links to general lines in the description, but it's just like, don't wait until someone's dead or you've got a broken arm or the police are forced to intervene, and don't carry your abuser with you, because until you exercise them, until you start to challenge that programming, they can act out in your life through your subconscious. They can act out in various ways. They can act out, like me, by persecuting you with voices. I don't know. It's just It's a horrible subject for me to talk about, but it's just something that I've never really broached before. There's been a thread of it for many years. I've had to have so many different forms of therapy for so many different narratives surrounding this kind of system, and it made me psychotic, made me kill myself, which made me psychotic. And it's just like, and I had ongoing symptoms, schizophrenia symptoms. I don't know, it's getting a bit bleak now, but the point is that it's never too late to act, and talking about these things isn't a shameful thing. That's kind of why this is what I want to end on. There's no shame in like just being honest. Like, people are abusing me. It doesn't need to be a violent declaration of intolerance. It needs to be however you go about it. It doesn't need to be some humble, wittering thing either. You can. There's no shame in admitting when you're being abused. There's no shame, really, if you think about it, in challenging your own behaviour if you feel you've been abusive. And it could be some, you know, I talked about microaggressions earlier, and passive aggression, and acting out your own trauma through your own life. Like, you may not realise how much negative impact you're having on people because you're not addressing these traumas. And yeah, I can't comfortably talk about this anymore because I feel like I'm going to have a panic attack. But whatever you do, you're not alone. No matter who you are, if whoever watches this, I don't know, you're not alone in these things. If you have suffered abuse of any kind, it's happened before and it'll happen again. The main thing to do is to take yourself out of that process and to get to the point where A, you're not proliferating it, B, you're not absorbing it and internalizing it, and C, you're able to challenge it effectively within a safety net that prevents you from continuing to be abused and have people infiltrate your life and seed things. And I don't know, yeah, I'm going on a bit, but God just bless every single person that can relate to this. And like, thank you for watching. It's not exactly an easy watch, and if this resonates with you, please like, or just share it if you think it's something that someone, I don't know, someone might, this video might be useful to them. I don't know. I've done a plethora of perspectives, and I started at hardball and came back round to how I actually feel about it right for the end of the video, so that's the main point. So yeah, I've been David Bradley, aka Schizophreniforms, and thank you for watching.